Hello, and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. I feel so privileged you are taking time out of your busy life to learn all about the ways to interpret neurodivergence for you and your child. Remember, all advice on this podcast is general and may not specifically apply to your child, so we encourage you to also talk to your GP, paediatrician or specialist to see if what you've learned will help your family. Good day and welcome to episode 3 of You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. We have the incredibly passionate Anthony Brown today. He is Principal Psychologist at ADHD Therapy Australia, and he'll be talking to us about all things ADHD. We're in for a little bit of a longer session today, so make sure that you either buckle up and put the headphones on, or you pause us midway so that you can have space to listen to the full episode. There really is a lot of information in here, so looking forward to the chat. Anthony is an experienced therapist. He's a registered psychologist. He's got extensive experience working with adults with ADHD from a variety of cultures and communities, including the LGBTQIA+ community and First Nations. Anthony works in an integrated framework that tailors his therapeutic approach to the specific needs of the client and approaches therapy with authenticity, compassion, and empathy. So he's got particular expertise and passion in working with people who have ADHD and a passion for helping people perform at their best in their studies, careers, and relationships. Anthony is trained in a range of therapeutic approaches such as dialectic behaviour therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and the Gottman method for relationships. And Anthony is registered with Medicare. Anthony also comes to us with some lived experience, so he will definitely be talking to us from a place of knowledge and compassion. So we definitely look forward to the chat with Anthony today. Good morning, Anthony, and welcome to the show. I am so privileged to have you on today, and I'm really excited for our conversation, talking all things ADHD. I think we may as well just jump straight into it with a good old definition. What is ADHD?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. ADHD is a condition that affects the ability to kind of perform consistently with the skills and knowledge that you have. It's not a very well named condition. The full name is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it's not entirely a deficit of attention. It's not entirely hyperactivity. Some people would say it's not entirely a disorder. For people with ADHD, they often know what to do. They have the particular skills. They know not to do that particular thing. But because of the biological impacts of ADHD, it's very difficult for them to perform consistently with what they know to do, with their knowledge and skills.
Beautiful. Thank you for that summary. So what causes ADHD?
So I guess the thing to keep in mind is ADHD is a very genetic condition. I feel like a lot of parents, worry about that type of thing. Worry about, well, is this something that I did? Or, some part of my parenting, or something that related to kind of early childhood exposure to something. But no, largely genetic. This is a very genetic condition. It exists across the world very continuously. And it affects the biology of someone with ADHD. ADHD is a lack of stimulation to the central nervous system and the prefrontal cortex. So there are some neurochemicals that kind of keep us motivated and alert. Dopamine, which is kind of the kind of neurochemical that rewards behavior and keeps us motivated and helps us kind of with movement as well. And then there's noradrenaline, which kind of keeps us alert and kind of keeps us active in that way. And for people with ADHD, they have dopamine and adrenaline. We all do, but it's inconsistent. Some days they have plenty kind of running around their central nervous system, and other times it's just not there, doesn't show up. So, and that makes it difficult for people to perform consistently, because when all those neurochemicals are there, it's so easy to kind of keep, doing the things that you do and, doing the skills that you kind of have. But when it's not there, it's really hard to even bring those things to mind. Another part of ADHD is the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain around about the forehead. And it's the part of the brain that is like the control center of the brain and body. It's the one that makes the decisions, prioritizes, organizes, manages things like movement, impulse control. And, it's like the captain of the ship. It's the one that kind of decides what things happen, where things go. And for people with ADHD, that part of the brain is understimulated too. So, those prioritizing and impulse control and suppressing movement, all of that can be a lot harder. And interestingly too, melatonin production. So melatonin is the hormone that makes people feel sleepy and want to go to sleep. That's delayed in people with ADHD. It comes, but it's typically an hour and a half later than neurotypical peers, which is one of the reasons why people with ADHD have a lot of trouble getting to sleep, because they don't really get those biological cues from their body until a lot later. And then typically it's a lot harder for them to get up.
My Mr. Six, that's him exactly. So he's what we would call a night owl. And we already joke about how, as a teenager, if this is how he wakes up at the moment, we are a little bit worried about what it's going to be like when he's a hairy, sweaty 16-year-old.
Yeah, as a person with ADHD, I can relate. Like, I'm not easy to get to sleep at night.
So are there different types of ADHD?
Yeah, so, it's an interesting thing, right? Like, back in the day, you'd kind of referred to ADHD, which is the hyperactive type of ADHD, and then you'd refer to ADD, which was the more inattentive type. And those subtypes came roughly around about the 1980s, because they wanted to distinguish between, people with like predominantly inattentive symptoms and prominently hyperactive impulsive. But what they found is that those conditions are actually really linked, and a lot of people have like a combination of symptoms. So what they have now is 3 subtypes. They have the primarily hyperactive impulsive subtypes, where, people have a sense of restlessness. They need to move. They might be, more likely to talk a lot or interrupt people, difficulty waiting. But some people might have the more inattentive symptoms, where they don't really have as much of that, but they have, difficulty kind of paying attention. Their mind gets distracted by a bunch of random, unrelated thoughts, difficulty listening. And, when you're getting distracted by all these random, unrelated thoughts, it makes organization so much more difficult. Like, if you're getting distracted by a song that you remember from 10 years ago, like, it's hard to kind of keep your mind on, like, where did I put my keys again? Or, like, when do I need to show up for that appointment? People have a hard time organizing the time. They might be a bit of what we call time blind, where, keeping track of like what 5 minutes in their head is pretty difficult, not intuitive. So, that's the inattentive type, but most people have a mix of both. So, and we call that the combined type of ADHD. And it's really interesting, people in their lifetime will start off more likely with a mix of hyperactive symptoms, especially around preschool age. But as they move through their life, those hyperactive impulsive symptoms will tend to be more suppressed. And they'll still be there, but they'll be kind of pushed under because they're less socially acceptable to have. Like, tend to be a bit more social pressure not to kind of interrupt people or run around, not sit down in places. So it's more likely that adults will kind of identify with the inattentive subtype of symptoms, and be a bit more common.
That's really interesting. I am always fascinated about the brain's capacity in some aspects to adapt, and in some aspects it's to squash. Would you say that type of squashing behaviour, I mean, really it's a form of masking. Does that have its own challenges, do you think, as people mature?
It can. Especially masking. It can have a lot of different challenges that come with it. I think mainly people associate masking with exhaustion, because you're trying to be someone that you aren't. And masking is very different from accommodating for symptoms. When you're accommodating for them, you know that this is a thing that you do, you know that it's okay to do, and then you kind of give yourself the option whether or not to, kind of accommodate for that and like do it in a way that would better fit the situation, or you do it in a way that would better fit you. You try to balance that out and make it fit more. Whereas with masking, a lot of it's just pushing down and saying, I can't do that at all. And that's really tricky. Like the hyperactive impulsive symptoms, some people learn that it's not okay to fidget with ADHD. So they push it down, they don't fidget. But the interesting thing is fidgeting is a compensation strategy. Like if you're fidgeting, you're stimulating your central nervous system. So typically people who fidget a little bit with ADHD are better able to focus in situations. So that masking may not actually make your ADHD easier to manage. It might actually make it a little bit more tricky.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So I suppose in a way that leads really, really beautifully into, well, what are some misconceptions around ADHD? What isn't ADHD?
Yeah, so, there are a fair few misconceptions around ADHD. Let's see.
I know while you're just having a look at your notes there, I know from my own anecdotal experience, there was a lot of conversation in the late 90s and early 2000s around ADHD. It became really, really popular in the media, probably referred to a lot more as ADD at that particular point in time, with lots of video clips of badly behaved children screaming and throwing things, running around classrooms, and a lot of perception that children needed to be heavily medicated to manage what was almost displayed as bad behaviour. And we certainly see different perceptions of that today. What are your thoughts on how that may have grown?
Well, I think it's interesting, right? Like, I think there was a strong link between ADHD and kind of misbehavior in kids. And to the point where I think one of the common misconceptions is that people think of ADHD as entirely kind of being misbehavior. Which I think is challenging, right? Because, if you put a kid in a classroom where, classrooms can be pretty quiet and, there's a lot kind of going on, and the child might be kind of expected to do some kind of multi-step instruction tasks, which they may not have fully understood the instructions, or they might have missed this part. Misbehavior is just something that kind of happens, right? If you put someone in a situation that's not accommodated for them, and especially if they're a kid, they're not going to behave very well. Not a reasonable expectation to make. So, when kind of looking at misbehavior, as a psychologist, I kind of think misbehavior is always the kid trying to tell you something. It never just happens because they're being naughty. It's always for a reason. And for people with ADHD, it's kind of thinking, well, how well is this situation set up for them? If it's set up to accommodate them well, things tend to get a lot easier. If it's not set up well for them, well, that's tricky, right? So that's one part of it. But the other part is for the inattentive symptoms of ADHD, there just isn't a lot of misbehavior. It's the daydreamy child who stares out the window, who may never disrupt the class, maybe just be quiet, but, mind focused on something else. And I think a lot of parents go, well, they couldn't have ADHD because they never get in trouble. Well, getting into trouble is not necessarily a part of ADHD. It sometimes might cause disruptions, but I think sometimes for those young people, it could be a much more subtle thing.
Yeah, and quite dangerous is probably a loaded word, but they learn how to fly under the radar. So if they miss instructions in class, they'll learn how to fudge their way around it. And unfortunately, sometimes you can end up with a child who has missed out on learning and academic opportunities, and it hasn't been picked up because they are staring out the window instead of wanting to get up and, knock their chair back and move around the classroom. So, those kids need just as much assistance in being able to bring back their focus as the ones who need opportunities to move.
Yeah. Kids are pretty bright. They look around the class. They learn the rules and they figure out how to mask effectively. And I think a lot of kids, they will look around at what their peers are doing, they look around at what their teacher's doing, and they'll figure ways to get by. And one thing that's really common for people with ADHD, sometimes auditory processing can be really hard. They'll literally hear the sound, but it won't get kind of taken up into their brain and they won't understand the instruction, which is an interesting thing, right? Because if they hear the sound, they might be able to respond. And they'll go, yep, okay, no worries. But they won't have actually processed the instruction. And to someone on the outside, that might look like misbehavior if they do it. Because they're like, well, why didn't you follow the instruction? And the automatic assumption there is to take it personally. Well, they didn't want to do it. But, if they didn't really hear that sound, Like they may not even be aware that they're doing that. That can come very automatically to people.
Yeah.
But that's the challenge, right?
100%. I'm just going to scroll down here so we can continue this incredible conversation. Oh, so you've got a dot point here to talk about, and I'm really fascinated with this: ADHD and intelligence. And there's definitely some misconceptions that will come about through that, as we've been talking about, whether it's the lack of capacity to actually focus and pay attention to things that they're learning, or the lack of capacity to actually sit still while the learning is happening. It's not a direct impact on their intelligence, though, is it?
No, ADHD is not really correlated with intelligence. Typically, like people with ADHD, they're very typical level of intelligence, that neurotypical peers would have. There are some areas that are impacted, like, things like working memory, which is the brain's ability to kind of store information, which, happens if you're having difficulty paying attention to different things that are happening around you. And sometimes processing speed, like for some young people, it might take them longer to get the instructions and to kind of pick up on things. But processing speed's very poorly correlated with intelligence. Some people just need a little bit more time to get the right answer. So once you accommodate for those things, though, people with ADHD are capable of doing a lot of different things. In my adult practice, I see doctors, lawyers, professors, psychologists, a lot of psychologists, teachers, the profession, right? Like there are people out there with ADHD.
And I didn't delve into it, but I might step back while we're talking about that. And when you talked about the genetics around ADHD and how it is a genetic condition, we're talking to parents and carers here, so predominantly talking about children, but it would be remiss not to mention that genetic connection and the prevalence now, or the increase in adult diagnosis of ADHD. So would you say that you often see a connection where a child has ADHD and then a little bit further down the track, the parent might go, I maybe do some of those things too?
It's ironic. Sometimes not even that far down the track, like you'd be in the assessment with the child and the parent would go, I do a fair bit of that. And then you just see it dawn on their face of going, oh. Which, I mean, like, that's the thing, right? Like multiple generations of the same family. People can have ADHD. And I think that can be like a bit of a challenge for parents at times, because they're like, well, my child doesn't have ADHD. I did the exact same thing. Like all my siblings did the exact same thing. And yet, that can be the case, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but, that still may be indicative of ADHD.
I can also imagine that once if you do have a child that's diagnosed with ADHD and you start to work out some of the accommodations that help around the home with that child being able to, remember things or have the space to move, that those tools in turn could benefit the parents as well.
Oh, so much so. For families with ADHD in the family, multiple generations especially, morning times, getting ready for school, getting breakfast, getting people dressed, getting out the door can be very, very difficult. A lot of things to organize. Everyone's tired. It's before medications have really set in, and it can be a tough thing. It can be really distressing. And the diagnosis can make all of that a lot easier, because then you can get the therapy and the accommodations and just the understanding that that's okay. Like, that is challenging for a biological reason. Because I think like a big concern that parents might have with these behaviors is they see these behaviors that stem from something biological, and then they kind of think, well, no, that's a reflection of my parenting. I'm failing as a parent. And that's just not true. The mornings are difficult because there's not enough dopamine and noradrenaline or melatonin production in like the central nervous system and prefrontal cortex. So no matter how good a parent you are, you can't change that.
No, and there's also so many things to do to instruct a child to help you with as well. So it's loaded with almost like weaponized functions for those kids and parents to have to work through in such a short amount of time.
Yeah. When you wake up in the morning, it's like, well, I know you're still tired, but can you do a million things?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and do a million things in a period of time, like, in an hour to like or so, that, when the person doesn't really kind of remember half of those things and not even really fully sure what that hour time period kind of intuitively is. So, I mean, some things are tricky because they're tricky.
I can just imagine that we've got parents and carers that are nodding their heads furiously listening to this. That's a really personal anecdote. I think that rings true for a lot of people. So that was a great example.
The nice thing to know is that can get easier.
Yes. Yep. That's it. We do have tools. That's the amazing thing. We do have tools. So we've been discussing, in a way, without narrowing straight down into it, the complexities for ADHD, the things that are tricky. Do we want to dive into that area now? Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, for sure. So, ADHD can have a big impact on people's lives. And I would say a little bit of a content warning, like some of these things can be a little bit difficult to hear as a parent. I would kind of say that with a diagnosis and like with proper support, all these things get easier. And the long-term impacts do change. We have a lot of really good studies to suggest longitudinal studies from children's lifetimes and when they grow up into adults that these things do get better. But there can be huge impacts. So education. People with ADHD are less likely to complete high school. They're more likely to drop out early. They're less likely to go on to things like TAFE or university. And if they're in TAFE or university, they're more likely to drop out there and drop out earlier than their neurotypical peers. One thing you see a lot of with adults is building up huge amounts of HECS debt from different courses that they've tried, which is an interesting thing. And just to note, if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, like you can try to get some of that repealed. There's a bit of a process. It doesn't happen all the time, but it can be a good thing to kind of look into.
That's a hidden little gem that we've gotten in the podcast. Thank you.
So a workplace as well. People with ADHD are more likely to be fired from a workplace because of performance issues. There is a wage gap that comes with ADHD. People with ADHD may earn $2 less than average than their neurotypical peers. There can be an impact on relationships and family life, more likely to be divorced, more likely to have relationship conflict. There can be some difficulties with parenting as well. I think like the big ones are physical and mental health. Mm-hmm. So if you have ADHD, you're more than likely to the rates of things like depression, anxiety, other mental health conditions are typically double. Much more likely to experience them, yep. Partially because of the biology of ADHD, but partially because if those things are left unmet for a period of time and unsupported, it can make just for a lot of difficulties in life. Yep. That can have an impact on someone's mental health. Yep. But physical health is a huge thing. One thing, accidents. People with ADHD are far more accident prone. When I was working with kids, it was so often that I'd see, I used to practice in an area that was very big on mountain biking. Mm-hmm. And very common for me to see a young person who'd break their arm twice a turn. Just really consistently, they'd have one arm to get it broken, then they'd have the other arm. Because it's just so, people with ADHD can be a little bit into adrenaline because adrenaline can stimulate the central nervous system. And sometimes that leads to a bit of risk-taking. But also just if you're distracted all the time, you just miss things.
Yep. Get ready to know the name of all your emergency room nurses.
And sometimes that can be, like driving can be a really difficult thing. You can be more likely to have driving car accidents, more likely to have speeding fines as well. But some physical health conditions as well, like more likely to have cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dental problems are a really big one. Because I think dental problems are a really good example. A lot of health behavior is thinking in the long term and doing things that aren't really stimulating and are very easy to miss, like brushing your teeth. There's no real signal in the day to brush your teeth. If you're not in the habit, it's very easy not to do. So it's very easy to just let that go. And if you let that go for long enough, for a year, a couple of years, it can lead to a lot of damage to your teeth. And dental checks, well, no one's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, you need to go to the dentist on this day at this time. So it's easy to kind of miss that. But if you do that over the course of your lifetime, your teeth are really affected. And that can have a huge impact on your quality of life. It even have an impact on your life expectancy. And I guess one final kind of impact, ADHD can have an impact on someone's life expectancy as well. People with ADHD can live on average 12 to 13 years less than their neurotypical peers. I say that like, and it's a pretty alarming sort of statistic, of course. With treatment, that does get easier, like with the proper support. And that's some good studies about the impacts of medication on that, and behavioral therapy. A lot of that is driven by accidents when people are younger. But I think that that's one of the reasons why this is such a, as far as the kind of mental health conditions kind of go, like that is one of the higher life expectancy impacts that we see.
Okay. And look, you're right, that is a really scary number, but it does highlight how important it is to bring the right support systems around your child and have them understand their own ADHD, to give them that position to be able to empower themselves to work on that with the right teams around them, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Like, these things can get better.
And so does ADHD present differently across males and females?
Yeah, definitely. Across the gender spectrum, ADHD can look very different. So I think a big part of it is there is different expectations for different gendered groups. Like for non-cis males, there is a lot more expectation on how to behave, and a lot more kind of emphasis to fit in a certain way. Basically sexism, right? Like, and young people kind of like pick on that, up on that very, very early. So what we typically see is more of a suppression of the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. They're still there. Like, they come out, tend to be a bit of restlessness, and that might come out as a bit of people pleasing, or maybe even kind of like trying to people please by focusing on schoolwork. Some of them might be, might even lead to a bit of high achieving, sort of, doing really well at school, like conversely. But typically a lot of daydreaminess, a lot of inattention, a lot of losing things, being late, more on the inattentive spectrum of symptoms. And that has a couple of impacts, right? So for non-cis males with ADHD, their symptoms may not actually be noticed until high school or late primary school. Because if you have predominantly inattentive ADHD, the environmental impact needs to be demanding enough to actually make those symptoms obvious. And sometimes, like if you're in primary school, you just don't need to pay attention that much, as much as you do when you're kind of in later primary school or early high school, because, people break down the work for you and you're not expected to be as independent. But so for non-cis males, like it might be that in kind of early high school, middle high school, those symptoms become a bit more obvious, and that's the diagnostic criteria in Australia. Like, it's suggested that symptoms need to be present before the age of 12. Typically to make a diagnosis of ADHD. In Australia, the guidelines suggest that it's under the age of 14. And for some people, they may not really notice the impact of their symptoms until later in early adulthood, like university age. There's like, intelligence is another part that can mask these symptoms. If someone has a very intelligent, the capacity of their intelligence might hide a lot of the impact of the ADHD symptoms until much later. But, there are also some impacts on symptoms expression as well, based around the biology of people with ADHD. So for non-cis males, like typically there's more estrogen, and estrogen can kind of impact the expression of dopamine and noradrenaline. So for people who menstruate, like that may impact, the menstrual cycle might impact the expression of their ADHD. Earlier in the cycle, they might find their ADHD symptoms are easier to deal with. And later in the cycle, it might be a lot harder. To the point where I've heard some psychiatrists actually changing medication depending on where someone is in their cycle. But, even things like menstruation or pregnancy can impact the symptoms of ADHD. After a pregnancy, someone might notice a flare-up of symptoms that might be linked to some postpartum depression or anxiety. And with menstruation, like levels of estrogen start to drop, which means that the ADHD symptoms might get more obvious in later life, to the point where more and more people are getting diagnosed with ADHD in their older life, like when they're a bit more elderly.
Okay. And so Anecdotally, I've heard that female diagnoses has increased. Do you have a comment on that at all? Do you believe that that's actually correct, or do you think that we've just developed a greater understanding of the spectrum of ADHD?
Definitely. It definitely has increased. So if you had to place it, when do you think the first study on how ADHD presents in women was done? If you had to place it in a
It's
year.
probably going to terrify me.
That's the answer, yeah. 1997.
Oh, goodness me. Yeah, wow.
So, it's ridiculous, right? Like, and there wasn't really many studies done until very recently. Like, for a lot of women, like they just wouldn't have known the way that their ADHD presented, so they missed them. And I think a key thing is, like, women are also more likely to do health-related behaviors. So they're more likely to engage with the diagnostic process. They're more likely to follow up with treatment. So a lot of the interest in ADHD and treatment of ADHD and increased diagnosis of ADHD stems from women seeking treatment, because if you only study half the population, like you typically get only half the population diagnosed. Who would have thought?
Yes, I did. I did hear a really interesting chat not that long ago about how many research participants in a lot of universities are early 20s white males. So that kind of follows on with that piece of information.
Yeah. It's really ridiculous, right? And especially because of those social forces and biological forces that we've talked about, ADHD looks really different. And that tends to mean that there's an underreporting of symptoms for young women. And it can be really good to kind of look out for that. Like, teachers are less likely to kind of notice those symptoms in kind of earlier childhood, because they're expecting ADHD to be, the 8-year-old hyperactive boy who can't sit still and disrupts the class. And I think that's getting easier. I think, the great thing about what's happening at the moment is there's just so much more awareness and conversation around what ADHD is. But it can be really good to kind of be aware of that expectation, because part of the diagnostic process is getting collaborative information from different sources. So bias has an impact on medicine, and there is a systemic bias towards the way that it presents for cis males.
And I can't tell you how many behaviour checklists I have completed for my children over the last few years. And I'm always told by, whether it's the paediatrician or the specialist that I'm dealing with, to make sure that you think of your child on the worst day. I guess, almost the reverse bias in a way. You always want to see the best in your children, and you want to provide accurate data and thinking about when you're not scaffolding them. And they would have to perform a task by themselves. But bias definitely would heavily play into that information delivery.
It's a really good point too, because I think, like, people, ADHD isn't a good thing or a bad thing. I like to see it in a very value neutral way. Kids with ADHD can be amazing and, lovely kids. I really enjoy working with them. My favorite people to talk to. But ADHD is a condition of inconsistency, right? So some days they'll be able to perform fairly consistently with what they know, and really skillfully, because they have the dopamine and noradrenaline in their system. So they're fine. But you don't want to get them on the days that they're performing consistently. You want to when they're under a little bit of strain and stress. And I think, like, there can even be a little bit of a noted bias, like when they're in a therapist's office, because it's new and stimulating. And there may not be a lot of demands on their, cognition. They might actually not show a lot of the symptoms of ADHD in that office. So this is tough, right? This is a condition defined by inconsistency. So, it's not always going to be as obvious to all the observers.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And look, I always love talking about these strengths, because I think it's a really great part. We're always looking at the deficits, I think, when we're talking about different neurological conditions and different neurodivergences. So I'd love to hear the strengths you see around ADHD.
So this is a really fascinating area that's being researched more and more. I think it's coming out of the whole idea of neurodiversity, that there are just different types of brains in the world, and looking at the strengths that come with ADHD. I think it can be really helpful too, because there can be a lot of grief that comes with a diagnosis. People kind of thinking, well, what does this mean for the rest of my life, the rest of my child's life? Does this mean that they're not going to be able to do the things that they want to do, or going to have a big impact? And I think the good thing about that is, like, if it's accommodated for, people can live quite happy, independent lives, and there can be some real strengths that come with it too. So the studies that we have at the moment suggest that people with ADHD are more likely to have like this great sense of drive, like, the energy that comes with the condition and the ability to focus really intently on the things that do provide them stimulation. People with ADHD can do really well in a niche where they're allowed to kind of perform in the moment with the knowledge that they have. And that can lead to excellent things. The Olympics is on at the moment. Simone Biles, person with ADHD. And, there are 3 different gymnastic techniques that no one else has ever done before, but she has. A little bit of that, just a bit, is the ADHD hyperfocus, right? Like, in some contexts, like athletics, ADHD is not considered a weakness. It's considered to be a really beneficial thing in that context. But, also more creativity. People with ADHD get distracted by all these different random and unrelated thoughts, and that can be really good for problem solving and thinking outside the box. Empathy. I think sometimes if you see the world in a different way, it can lead you to, be better at perspective taking and kind of reaching out to people. And a bit of that verbal hyperactivity can make some people really good at talking, and connecting with others. One thing that I think I see a lot in my practice and clinicians comment on is because of the changes that happen with ADHD, one day something being difficult and one day something being easier, the inconsistency of ADHD. People with ADHD tend to be pretty hopeful. Like, they know that things will change because they do. So, as far as the group goes, that they can be a little less likely to give up and can see things can get better. And I mean, ADHD isn't a monolith. Some people with ADHD definitely don't do that, but I think these are things that can come from ADHD. Some people refer to ADHD as being a bit of a superpower. I get what they mean. If you've seen something in deficit for so long, it's nice to kind of think about the positives of that. Although there are parts of ADHD that I wouldn't necessarily say are a superpower. It's not a superpower losing my keys 3 times a week. I'd rather that not happen. But it's not a bad thing. And I think one of the benefits of treatment is, after a while, when you initially feel that grief, you kind of accept that this is just a thing about you, like anything else,
That's right. Yep. Just something that you learn to find your own accommodations with. The same way that if you had diabetes and you had to find your way to exist around it, it just is who you are.
Yeah, diabetes is a really good example. I would say that out of all the physical health conditions, diabetes, it's a lot like it, because you take some medication, you change your behavior, you monitor it through the day, and things will change. Like, your blood sugars will go up and down. ADHD can be a lot like that.
Beautiful, beautiful comments on strengths there. And it really connected me, actually. My Miss 4 and my Mr. 6 are both hugely empathetic. And so listening to that really rang true for me. And it is a gorgeous thing to witness when they've got that compassionate view of the world that they've developed, through their own experience, to then be sharing that with others. And I think that certainly can't be discounted. That's pretty magical.
Yeah. The value of people is not their ability to kind of pay attention to tasks and suppress movement. That's just not people more complex than that. I think one thing for people with ADHD is, if they find their niche, if they find the thing that they really kind of engage with and enjoy, that can be really helpful in themselves, the thing that kind of provides them stimulation, and, it can be a real strength. And for people, that can be so many different things. For some people, it will be kind of talking to other people, might be a specific area of interest or particular field of knowledge. There's so many different ways that someone can have a rich life. And ADHD doesn't need to stand in the way of that if it's accommodated for, if it's known about.
Yes, most definitely. The importance of a diagnosis and arming yourself with information, it really can't be, it can't be overlooked as to how much it can actually change something. So I look forward down the track. We're actually going to have a conversation on this podcast about labels, the views around labels and what a diagnosis can do in terms of empowering and how nervous people can become with labels. But we're definitely pro label here, and the position that it gives you in terms of being able to be informed and to make choices, I think is incredible. So yeah, I'm all with you on that one. You've got a really interesting topic here that I'm looking forward to jumping into, and that is the prevalence of ADHD in Australia and the world. Now, you've got some statistics that you're going to talk about in terms of how it appears. I'd also love, if you don't mind, adding to that where you think, what countries or what places you think actually assist with ADHD in the best way. I think that would be fascinating too. So, but yeah, please let me know.
Well, for sure. So because of the biological nature of ADHD, it's fairly consistent, across populations. Roughly, we're looking around about 5% of the population, or 1 in 20 people. There are some studies from more recent years to suggest that might be closer to 7%. With, accounting for different gender differences with ADHD. And, that seems to be very consistent in every country where there's the health infrastructure to do the diagnostic work. The only country where it's a little bit higher is America, where it tends to be at about 10%. And then it's hard to say, where that kind of lands. There's a lot of debate in the community around that, but it does seem to be about 5% of the population. And that is roughly 1 million Australians.
It's one in every classroom.
Yeah, one in every classroom. Yeah. Exactly. It's a lot of different families, right? Like, and multiple generations of the same family, and significant amount of the population, and that's very consistent across the world. Like, there are some countries where there's not the health infrastructure to kind of look into this further, but I've read some articles to suggest that in China it would be 45 million people.
Oh wow.
Which, it's double like the population of Australia.
Yes, that's enormous.
And, I think there's some benefits to knowing that, right? And sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Oh, just if there are any particular countries that seem to have a greater, I guess, infrastructure that they've created around assisting with ADHD. So whether it's through studying or therapies or changes to the education space, anything like that.
I think there are so different countries do different things really well. I think for studies of ADHD, they're the Scandinavian countries. They do this really sensible thing where they have a lot of their health data available for research. So they're able to do these big studies, hundreds and thousands of people, and see like what accommodations and what different things are kind of helpful for their treatment. And you learn so much with those big population studies. Fascinating what you can see. If you ever want to lose a couple of days worth of time looking at journal articles, I definitely recommend that. I think there, and like I think some parts of America can be very good for accommodations. There's a lot of like really good research and therapy that come out of different parts of America. As far as countries go, I think like Australia and New Zealand do well at some things. Like, we have a really good culture around disability here because of the NDIS. Like, we can be very grateful for the impact on the way that the NDIS has shaped the way that we see things like neurodiversity and disability. And, one part of my job is I go to conferences all around the world and look at, different kind of research cultures and therapy cultures. I gotta tell you, the Australian conferences are the nicest. Like, there's a really good lived experience culture here. It's not just academics talking about how ADHD appears to them, even though they're often quite neurotypical. There are people with ADHD starting off the conference talking about what it's like actually having the condition, and it just grounds things. I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of practitioners here who have ADHD, and they talk about what it's like. And I think like it's not a perfect system. Like, it's hard getting a diagnosis in Australia. It's expensive. There is a lack of treatment for regional and rural areas. And those are hard problems, but there are good people working on solutions. And I think this is a thing that could get better and better in time.
I think one of the amazing things that I see in this space, from my lived experience as a parent and a carer, is actually the passion of the specialists that you work with. And it's a really great point that there are so many that come from a place of lived experience, and whether that's, them being neurodivergent themselves or having a friend or a family member that is, and then wanting to take how they see that and how they want to empower that person or themselves into their career. And I can tell you from a client perspective, you can always feel it. You can always feel it. And there is definitely something when you create a team for your child and you know that the people around them actually understand and care about what they're going through, it makes a significant difference.
Yeah, it definitely can. The sense of empathy, and I feel like a lot of clinicians, when we get into this work, we do it because we really want to help, and that's a big part of it. And you see a lot of that here.
I think it's really, we might jump into now, if you're all right with that, talking about the early signs of ADHD. We've sort of covered some of the symptomology, but if we're talking to the parents and carers who are, nodding their heads along to some of this and going, I'm wondering, do I just have a busy kid, or could I have a child that might have ADHD? How do they start to maybe even journal what they're thinking they're seeing and correlating that to whether or not it could be something?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of sense to looking in early, because I guess it's worthwhile thinking about, do you really lose anything by kind of looking into it early? Like, a big part of the diagnosis is having documentation of symptoms under the age of 12, 14. And if you're looking into it earlier, you're more likely to gather that kind of information. And that can be really helpful for healthcare in later life. Can be really useful information to know. So some of the earlier symptoms, like when you're starting to look at preschool symptoms, preschoolers already have a lot of the hyperactive impulsive behaviors that you kind of associate with ADHD, and that's really normal for that age, right? Like, it's kind of looking at behaviors that are a little bit more kind of disruptive, like than their peers, or if they're a bit more kind of conflict between kind of other peers in the kind of classroom, more comments from early childhood educators. I think that can be a good sign to just do a little bit more investigation. Some of the inattentive signs, though, can be a little bit trickier to see. Because, as we said before, they don't get as obvious until the work starts to become a little bit more independent and a little bit more multi-step. But, things like, lots of daydreamingness, difficulty listening, difficulty following instructions with more than one step can be really good things to look at. But I think one critical one is the difficulties with sleep. If your child has difficulties kind of getting down at night and getting to sleep, which can happen at a very early age, 3 years old, 4 years old, and it's hard for them to kind of settle at night, then that can be a really good symptom to kind of get checked, because there's a lot of different things that can do that. There's a lot of different things that can impact these symptoms and look like ADHD. But if you've documented that at an early age with medical reports, or getting people to fill out some surveys, or getting assessed, even if it isn't ADHD, at least then you kind of know what it could be. You have that documentation just in case, it becomes a little bit more apparent later in life that they might have ADHD. Really good to see those early warning signs.
And if we're starting to look at primary school and even moving through to secondary school, what becomes a little bit more evident then?
So a lot of people get the symptoms become more apparent around the age of 7 or 8, when things like reading, writing, mathematics start to be taught, because all those things involve multi-step instructions and a bit more independent work, and sitting down in a classroom doing that work. So those things can become a little bit more apparent at that age. And maybe like sometimes more of the disruption in class, someone getting out of their seat or fidgeting a great deal or talking to their friends in class. Those can be signs. Other times it might just be them staring out the window or staying in it after class because they haven't completed the work because they're going really slowly, or making lots of simple mistakes and spelling mistakes or misreading the question. And those things can be good to investigate. It may even be simple things like not getting their homework in really consistently, or leaving things behind at school or at their friend's place. A big one in Australia is with no hat, no play. Kind of how many times did they forget to bring their hat? Like, because that one tends to stand out a little bit in Australia.
What a great marker.
That's a good one to look for. But as they get into high school, then the independence it makes things a little bit more apparent because it's typical for people to maybe get themselves a bit more to school, or monitor their own homework, and that's when the impacts can become a bit more apparent.
And so when we start to have concerns, obviously our first step for anything, I think, is a general practitioner, GP, because they can then write whatever referrals that we need. But who are we looking at for assessments for ADHD?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different pathways for assessments. You can go to a psychologist who deals with the behavior around primary behavioral conditions. So what they might do is they might do an interview with the parent, just talking about what symptoms kind of may be present for that young person and getting some examples. They might also, and they'll talk about the impact of those symptoms on day-to-day life. They'll get information from different sources like parents, teachers, people that know the young person well. And they'll rule out any other mental health conditions that might be impacting. And that sometimes they might do neurocognitive tests, like maybe they'll do an intelligence test or like some other kind of neurocognitive tests, which doesn't happen all the time. But it can be good if there's certain comorbidities present, like other conditions that they need to rule out, like dyslexia, dysgraphia, but not all the time. So that can be helpful. If you're looking for more medication, you will need to see a pediatrician, which is a medical doctor that specializes in young people's health. And for an adult, that would be a psychiatrist, someone that a doctor that deals with mental health. And they're the ones that prescribe the medication for ADHD. In some states, the prescribing rules do change from state to state lines, so it can be good to get a GP to just kind of talk you through what happens in your estate. But also make sure that GP knows a bit more about ADHD and has a bit of background, because there are different levels of knowledge out there in the community. But I think that can be helpful because they're the ones that can talk about medication. But both psychologists and psychiatrists and pediatricians can make a diagnosis. It's just whether you want medication or not. And sometimes they do work collaboratively. You might get an assessment with a psychologist who then kind of refers you to a pediatrician. They might use parts of the assessment as a part of their assessment as well. So you don't need to double up as much.
And you've said what might be the magic bullet of the conversation that people are often asking about with ADHD, and it's the word medication. The word itself can be quite loaded in terms of people's perception. I think it's also, speaking from my own experience, it can be a journey to come to terms with medication. But we'd be remiss if we didn't actually talk about ADHD and the types of and the benefits of medication.
Yeah. So, this is, it's an interesting area to talk about. As a psychologist, I can't talk too much about the different types of medication. I'm not a doctor. I'm not my background. But it's an important thing to consider, because I think there's a bit of a misconception out there that, if you're diagnosed with ADHD, you kind of need to try the medication, and you don't. Like, it's really up to you about how you approach it. Medical consent is really important. And as a parent, it's really up to you whether or not your child tries medication or not. So you can get a diagnosis of ADHD, or your child can get a diagnosis, and you don't need to try medication. However, if you do, it's the gold standard of treatment, like a mix of medication, behavioral therapy, and accommodations. And it can be really helpful. Like, there are a lot of good studies to suggest that it can be. And, I think the key thing is if you've got a medical professional, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist who you feel comfortable with, a GP to kind of do the work in between sessions to monitor how things are going. Sometimes like your pediatrician or psychiatrist can give a letter of authority to make the your GP the one that kind of changes the dose and monitor things in between sessions. Definitely recommend that if that's something a pediatrician or psychiatrist is willing to do. I think the relationship between the parent or the person with ADHD and their medical professionals is really critical, because you don't need to go through this alone. Your doctor will listen to you, and kind of help you through the journey. And that's how to get the best outcome, really.
Fantastic. And then you've mentioned behavioural supports and accommodations. Can we have a little chat about what they might be?
So a big part of managing ADHD is just kind of knowing what's involved, and like knowing what the symptoms are and how to kind of think about those symptoms in day-to-day life. A lot of it comes down to knowing about how your ADHD works. If you know how your brain works, it's so much easier to deal with it in day-to-day life and accommodate for it. With ADHD, it's not necessarily treatment. You're not trying to make those symptoms go away. It's more about just kind of accommodating for them. So kind of knowing how you get motivated to do particular tasks, or how you can break down those particular tasks and get them organized for yourself. Knowing how the ADHD will work for your child. And, for parents, that would look a little bit like behavioral sort of parenting training. Which is kind of like a parent knowing how to structure things to make it easier for their young person to kind of, do the things that they need to do, and kind of making sure their teachers kind of know to do the same. As they get older, it's helpful to kind of pass the torch on to the young person to kind of make sure that they're kind of maintaining those accommodations and support, and, giving them the idea that I think that the ADHD isn't something that, their parents or their teachers are kind of making them kind of manage, but something that, that they can manage themselves and they have more autonomy over. And, even things like accommodations, kind of just talking about how to best present information in a classroom, or how to kind of remind young people to do certain tasks, or how to kind of talk to them about different tasks. These things can be really helpful. And schools do have a responsibility to kind of put those accommodations in place. It's part of legislation, places like New South Wales, to make sure things like ADHD are accommodated for in the classroom. So, typically schools are very receptive to these things.
Well, it makes the classroom environment easier for everyone involved, I think, when, children have the way that they can sit, feel comfortable, and have autonomy over themselves when it comes to listening and learning. And, sometimes that's physical accommodations as well. My Mr. Six sits on a peanut ball at his desk so that he can, get his movement while he's actually doing his work, and that works brilliantly. And yeah, as you said, sometimes it's the way things are described. Sometimes it's the use of visual schedules to take the pressure off a child having to remember multiple tasks. But I think the really important thing that comes across in this is that there are so many ways of actually supporting children when they're finding things difficult because of the way that their ADHD behaves for them.
Yeah, totally. And, the nice thing about that is if you give them those accommodations and get to know what works in that earlier part of the life, then they can kind of learn that works for them through the rest of their life. If you find that certain types of fidgets work really well for them and kind of helping them focus and channel that kind of need for movement, then they can use that for the rest of their life. I've got a fidget tent right here, right now, talking to help me focus on this interview. And that works for me. So, that's something that they can use then the rest of their life. And I think that's a big part of the diagnosis. It's always helpful to have self-knowledge. You're always in a better position if you know how you and your brain works.
100%. Couldn't agree more. So let's find out what ADHD Therapy Australia does.
Okay, so we're an online ADHD company that assesses and treats ADHD Australia-wide. So We do treatment for ADHD, helping primarily adults 17 above get accommodations and support for their ADHD entirely online. We do have some availability starting for new therapists. We have a clinical psychologist, Colleen, who is starting and doing a little bit of parenting training for parents with young people with ADHD, and a little bit of therapy as well for adults with ADHD. And we have an OT, Becca Roberts, starting soon too, who does a lot of more practical accommodation, study skills, emotional support. That can be really helpful. I'm really looking forward to having them kind of start. We do ADHD assessments well for adults with ADHD. This is the behavioral end of the ADHD kind of support. And we have short wait lists, 2-week wait list at the moment, fairly inexpensive. And, we provide a lot of support for seeking medical assessments later on in the diagnostic pathway if people want to pursue medication, or just lots of knowledge about learning about your ADHD symptoms after the assessment. We also do workshops for schools and different organizations to learn more about ADHD and accommodate for that in their day-to-day life. So that can be helpful. Oh, yes, Becca, our OT, also works for people under the above the age of 12. So good for the teenagers out there too. Just remember.
Beautiful. It's amazing to come across anywhere that has a 2-week wait list at the moment. So that's fantastic knowledge to have. We're in a space, I think, where those entering it are not at the rate of people needing it. So there's definitely high demand and short supply. So, yeah, that's really great to know. We will also be doing a mini-series in season 2 around different forms of interventions and therapies. So we will be breaking down what occupational therapy is for those parents and carers listening who don't know. They are the wonder drug of neurodivergence. They're amazing. So look forward to having that chat. Anthony, thank you so much for such an in-depth and passionate conversation today. I think that it's been really enlightening. I know I've learned a lot, and, I like to say that I do a lot of reading and a lot of studying, and I'm still learning loads and loads about ADHD. So I certainly know that those listening will have been learning a lot. I look forward to also putting some of the things that you've been talking about into some show notes to make sure that they can access them, definitely with how to access ADHD Therapy Australia. And I will, I'll be speaking to everybody else in about a fortnight. Anthony, thank you so much for your time, and have a beautiful day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for the chat. It's been really nice.
Be sure to check the show notes on our website for any links and references. You can find us at youcangrowyourownway.podbean.com. And if you found this episode helpful, we would love you to help us get the word out. You can share the podcast, tell a friend, and be sure to click the follow or subscribe button so you can access all our new episodes. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we would love to connect with you. You Can Grow Your Own Way recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this place, now known as Australia. We're coming to you from Jabberung, Jawajali and Wadawurrung country, the country of our guest speaker, and from wherever you are listening. We respect the elders of the past and present, and we share our friendship and kindness.